very much. It's a lovely turnout. I'm glad people are interested in the topic. It's very controversial. I don't shy away from controversy. I consider that the first order of business for a decent journalist. I like the H.L. Mencken definition. Is a journalist is someone who comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Great line. So what I'm going to talk about, this book I came published a year ago around the world. It's done respectably well. It's a serious nonfiction book. It's very robust intellectually. It's my most robust book. It has 45 pages of endnotes. It's out in paperback now. We didn't have to change a word. We didn't have to correct anything, which was like a first for me, because usually, you know, there's little things that change. And I wrote it from the point of view of big picture, 32,000 feet altitude. And I'll just note one thing. The title is Merger of the Century. Why Canada and the United States should become one country or one economy, whatever guise this may take. I have 86 more years to be wrong. But I think that basic thesis is there is a merger underway. There has always been a merger underway. A merger, economically for sure, politically possible, I think is inevitable and probably sooner rather than later. But I don't know. And what this book does is it explains the differences between the two countries, and it leads off really with the existential challenge. And I also challenge the national narratives of both countries in a way that I don't think other people have. So a couple of comments. Hillary Clinton wrote me a letter, called it thought-provoking, interesting. Ken Taylor, you may have seen the movie Argo about the Iranian hostage crisis. He was our Canadian ambassador. He called it courageous and a wake-up call to Canadians. So those are a couple of the endorsements. I won't tell you what people have said against it. Actually, they don't say much because Canadians are very polite. So they just don't say anything. So there hasn't been a lively controversy on this side of the border, and there hasn't been as much interest among the media elites in this country for obvious reasons, which I'll get into in a bit, as there has been piqued interest, curiosity in the U.S. And so that's the sort of background. I want to open with a quote, one of my favorite quotes, and I've lived in Canada since I was 19. I immigrated with a draft dodger during the Vietnam War, and we stayed, and I have American citizenship and Canadian citizenship, and also British citizenship because he was British. So I'm kind of a global person, and I really do understand America and Canada in a way that Canadians don't understand America and Americans don't understand Canada if they know it exists at all. And that's uncommon. That's uncommon but unfortunate. So I've been collecting and comparing and contrasting my entire life, being a bicultural person, because when you leave home, you never leave home. You're always kind of attuned to what's going on down there. And when I go to the U.S., which I do a lot, because I work there, I pay taxes there, I live there part-time, I'm sort of very Canadian. I think like a Canadian because I'm always contrasting. And when I'm here, I'm kind of American and I'm always contrasting. So it's a very weird psychological thing that immigrants would understand. That's the immigrant system. It also kicks you into observation and vigilance. So that's why my career of journalism was perfect, tailor-made for an immigrant like me who doesn't really belong anywhere and is always looking around to see what other people are doing. So I've collected quotations and anecdotes and historical facts and fact figures, and I've put this into the book. The book has a thesis, as I say, that a merger's underway, a merger of some kind is inevitable this century, and that's a good thing, and that one country is not superior to the other. They both have good points, they both have bad points. They've gone from being cousins to being siblings, and all of these sort of themes in the book. And then I have a thought experiment as to how we connect and merge, whether it be a European Union type construct or whether we just become the 13 next states of the United States and get paid for our resources by the new partnership. So I have a lot of fun with the economic model and the political model, and that's what the book is about. But one of the quotes that I've always enjoyed is a guy named Will Ferguson. He's an Albertan, and he won the Giller Prize for Fiction 2 years ago. And Will had a very, very funny, kind of cheeky line, and he said, "The great themes of Canadian history are to keep the Americans out, the French in, and hope that the natives somehow disappear." Pretty pointed. Pretty true. When you talk about the elites that have what they call the Laurentian consensus, the Ontario-Quebec elites that have really run Canada's political agenda and policy making and so on. By the way, the idea of merging with the United States is not as wag as it seemed. My research showed me, my historical research showed me that this idea was actually thought of and mentioned by Prime Minister Borden after the First World War and by Prime Minister Mackenzie King after the Second World War. And they just didn't feel they could do it or they had the political capital to pull it off. And those are not coincidental dates because the First World War, Canada was still a colony. Canada was a colony of Britain until 1931. It was a colony. It did not have any control over its foreign policy. It was dragged into the First World War without any request other than get yourselves over here. And it had no control over its legislature. Everything had to be approved in Britain. So Mother Country went bankrupt in the First World War, casting Canada and others adrift financially, and then of course it really went bankrupt after the Second World War. Again, so that's when those two prime ministers actually had asked the question and explored the possibility of joining forces with the United States. That is not taught in history books in Canada, but I have the facts in the book and I found that quite interesting. My point in this book is that the status quo for Canada, the United States, or anybody is not going to stay. It won't work. The geopolitical realignments, the other things that are going on, whether it's technology, technological advances, and so on and so forth, are bearing down on every country in the world. And that's another background noise that informs my thesis. And I'll explore that a little bit more. My bias is up front. I'm a business writer. To business people, it makes no sense to have two countries with a border between them. No sense at all. But then there's cultural things, and then there's historical things, and there's traditional things, and there's prejudice things. So, and legal differences. That's my bias, and my bias is also that I'm American and Canadian. I'm a citizen of both, pay taxes, work and live in both. I love both countries. I've dedicated this book to both my countries, which makes a lot of people shake their head. How can you be that way? I am. I'm a merger. I think a merger would work. So those are my biases going in. I understand both, and that's something that's interesting. I took on the two national narratives. In general, the Canadian narrative is gentler, kinder, we're a superior society over the Americans, those Americans. The American narrative is the same. American exceptionalism. There's no country on earth like us. Nobody as good as us. Nobody as smart as us. Nobody as rich as us. Both of them are wrong. Both of them are wrong. And I have a whole chapter devoted to the good things that Canada has and the bad things, and the good things that the United States has and the bad things. And then I have a chapter on synergies, what we could do together, from R&D to sharing resources to all kinds of wonderful things we could do together. Combined, the country would be the superpower of superpowers. Size of South America, biggest military, biggest tech, biggest economy, biggest everything in the world. Probably why my book sold more Chinese copies in China than in Canada. China does not want a merger like this. This is not a good thing for China. If you're thinking about policy and what the rival nation superpower is doing. I found that very interesting. I talk about the status quo. China has targeted Canada's resources and space. Russia has targeted the Arctic. Canada has a navy of 8,500 people, more shoreline than any other country in the planet. We cannot defend ourselves. We are defended through NORAD, and the Americans do all the heavy lifting. We cannot develop ourselves. We don't have the capital, the money. And most of the development of Canada has been foreign money, mostly American foreign money. So this is an existential challenge for a country like Canada, the second biggest piece of real estate, full of buried treasure, no military that can protect itself. and no capital to develop itself, and big powers sort of hovering around, trying to see what advantage they can take, you see where I'm headed. Canada has to get closer. We're already close with the United States. I say we have to get closer. And why don't we have the capital? Because we don't have a market. We don't have a big national market. The British left us with a constitution that makes the provinces so powerful that we have the most evolved federal system in the world. We have provinces fighting each other. We have tariff barriers internally. That's why our biggest, most successful companies have had to go to the U.S. to get bigger. We don't have a national economy. We have British Columbia saying to Alberta, we're not going to let the oil sands pipeline go through. Even though it's a legitimate, legal, environmentally, whatever you think, approved project, we're not going to let you do it. We're going to fight it. We have Quebec suing Newfoundland, saying we're not going to let you build a Lower Labrador hydroelectric project to sell in competition to us power to the Americans. This is not, shouldn't be allowed in a country. But Canada does not have what the Americans did. In 1880, they had the same squabbling and nonsense going on, and they created a fourth level of government called the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, which is more powerful than the federal government or the Supreme Court. It can impose a requirement that allows any legally constituted good or service to transport itself across state boundaries. Nobody can stop it. If there's environmental problems, sure you can stop it, but once those are crossed, you can't stop it. That made the United States the biggest, most powerful national economy in the world, made it a powerful country. It overtook Britain in size very quickly after it did that. We've never done that. We've never done that. That's a big problem. So we have balkanized provinces. We have a balkanized economy. We're getting picked off by foreigners very easily as a result of that. So what I end the book with is a chapter on what if there's no merger. These are the things Canada has to do. We have to have an ICC system, and we have to tackle a number of other problems, which I'll get into in a bit. But there are differences. There are impediments, certainly, to cozying up and becoming one country politically. First of all, their system isn't very good. I think the parliamentary system's a little better. But that aside, the economic divisions don't make sense. And we probably have the only free trade agreement in the history of the world, 26 years old, that has resulted in a border thicker and more difficult to get across than it was before we did it. Every other free trade agreement, as happened in Europe, as happened in West Africa, for goodness sake, has gone from a free trade agreement like we did 26 years ago to a security perimeter, to a customs union, to a monetary union, to an economic union, as they have in Europe, and a partial monetary union, which wasn't done very well, but nonetheless works okay. We haven't gone anywhere, and the reason for that is Mexico joined the free trade agreement. And Mexico and its border and its illegal immigration and its drug smuggling became a focus. So when you say NAFTA to somebody in the United States, they think Mexico. They never think about Canada. So what I'm proposing in this is an asymmetrical agreement where Canada and the U.S. can go further in the way in which it's obviously easy for them to do, same institutions, same rule of law, all of that, and get rid of the border between us, and Mexico would remain a privileged trade partner, but not be ready to come and join and get rid of the border. But every time that's suggested, the Mexicans scream, no, what about us? You can't get rid of a border with Mexico because their labor rates are 1/3. And their institutions are weak, the corruption, the crime, all of that. You can't open the border, but you can here. You could open the border between the two countries if you do a lot of blending of law enforcement, legals, customs, taxation, all of that would have to be done. And that's supposedly being undertaken right now under a security perimeter initiative that's gone nowhere for 8 years. Nowhere. That should be a priority for Canada in particular, because we're the ones that are going to suffer and are suffering as the border gets thicker and thicker and thicker. That's a big existential challenge for Canada. But even sociologically, economically, we're very dependent. I'll give you some stats. But sociologically, I think we become more similar. Since I've lived in Canada, and that's quite a few years ago, I don't want to tell you, and then you know how old I am. But since I've lived in Canada, I have seen Canada become more Americanish, and I've seen America become more Canadianish. I've just seen that in many ways. For instance, if you take the New England states, the border states in the West, the Pacific Northwest, and you take Minnesota and Wisconsin, North Dakota, that's roughly the population of Canada. About 34 million people live in those states. They have more liberal laws than Canada and lower crime rates than Canada. So you have like you have this cross-border thing happening that is very, very interesting and influential. And if you look at the presidential elections, you'll see the Democratic Party, which is the most liberal wing, because Canadians are more liberal than, we're more like New Englanders than, or Pacific Northwest people than other parts of the United States. You see the rise, the increase from the border down of Democratic power from the Canadian border down. It's quite fascinating. And it grows, it ebbs and flows, but it's there, and it's very big. And it represents 60% of the U.S. economy in presidential elections, the Democrats. So that's what I point to as the sort of similarity. I also have a whole chapter on polling that shows the similarity of in percentage support for liberal things like getting rid of capital punishment, euthanasia, abortion, gun controls. Americans and Canadians are about in sync. It's really strange, even though our laws are different. And that's because our system's different. But what are the differences? There are differences. And I wrestled with this personally because I said, why is it I'm so different, even having lived here so long, from my Canadian children, who to me sometimes are like Martians. I don't get them. Well, I do, but they're different. Canada is different than Americans. And here's what my sociological theory is. I looked at my own background from the Midwest. And the Midwest and the U.S. is a big melting pot, a big mosaic, the first to do it in the world. And there's a huge number of people, particularly in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, California, Texas, that are German. I'm half German, half Irish, half German. That's a common mixture. So I said, wait a minute, you know what? What rubs Canadians, what do Americans do that rubs Canadians the wrong way? Blunt, direct, manners aren't great, pushy, loud, right? I said, you know what? Canadians have a British sensibility. Manners, deportment, dress, your tone of voice, how you interact with other people, very important. It's a British sensibility. It doesn't matter what your background is. It can be German, Canadian, but you're a British sensibility. Americans have a Germanic sensibility. We have a Germanic sensibility. So I went to the census and I said, well, what is the percentage of Americans? Because they ask you for your nationality. Now, I've been in the census. I would never say I'm German because I had one grandmother from Germany, one from Luxembourg, one from Ireland, and one from, I was like this mixture. So I never would have said I was German. But it was shocking to me that the largest ethnic group noted on the 2010 census in the United States is German, meaning they're full-blooded German. There are more people who define themselves as Germanic in the United States than African Americans or Hispanics. I said, wow. And so then what I did for fun was I listed the presidents that are German background. Bush, Nixon, Eisenhower, Hoover. Obama's mother was half German, half Irish. On and on. Rumsfeld, Schwarzkopf. The number of German people. So what I extrapolated from this is one of the things that really annoys everybody about Americans is what annoys Europeans about Germans. Right? Pushy. Loud, direct. What do you mean? Do it this way. And efficient. Annoyingly efficient. Disciplined. great at science, tech, and math, and the best work ethics in the world. That's annoying. Come on. It's really annoying. And so that's what it is. That's the difference. And it could be a deal breaker. It might not be a deal breaker, but let me give you the stats. It's certainly not a deal breaker for many, many, many Canadians or Americans. We're already merging. Right now, 3 million Canadians live in the United States. It's almost 10% of our population. Another 1 to 2, we don't know, million were naturalized before 1978 and are still alive. Because they had to give up their Canadian citizenship when they naturalized before 78. So if they naturalized, which 1 to 2 million did, and assuming one of them, 1 million is alive, it doesn't show up as a Canadian. If you look at the number of, well, here's the next stat. This is mind-boggling. In the last century, 7 million Canadians immigrated to the United States. That was equivalent to its population in 1900. It lost its whole population in the course of a century. It replenished it. That is a staggering brain drain. Staggering brain drain. And I go into some of the famous Americans that have Canadian background. Disney, Edison, Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin. It's pretty mind-blowing how many of them have a Canadian background. So if you were to look, it's just a guess, if you were to ask every American resident if they had a Canadian grandparent, just one, not 4, 2, or 3, just one, I think you may be finding 30 million Americans who have a piece of Canadian background. It's huge. And in some parts like New England and the Pacific Northwest or Minnesota, it's a gigantic number. Equally interesting is in Canada, there's 1 million Americans living here. And I would say actually 3 million, because my 2 Canadian children haven't taken American citizenship because I told them not to unless they want to pay taxes for the rest of their life wherever they live. But if they want to live there, they've got the option. If you take the children of that 1 million Americans like me who live here, say 2 per customer, you're talking about a lot of people that have American ties, American background, or an option to become an American citizen. Canada's 800,000 First Nations are dual citizens under the Jay Treaty of 1765. Mohawk, Iroquois, they can come and go across the border. Sometimes they use their own native passport. So our First Nations are actually as American as they are Canadian, which is why they do flow back and forth. We are, as nations, one another's biggest customers, investors, suppliers. The foreign direct investment in absolute numbers that Canadians have invested in the United States is the same as Americans have invested in Canada. 90% of our exports go to the U.S. In fact, we are what we're known as, along with Sweden, intertrade countries. We don't really export. Most of that export stuff that we do to the United States is intercorporate transfers between a branch and a head office in both directions. That's called intertrade. That's not really exporting. So we really don't have an exporting nation culture. We're not exporting stuff all over the world. Big, big difference. Sweden has the same proportion vis-a-vis the EU. Canadians buy more goods and services from the United States than all of the EU 28 countries combined. Americans own about 12% of the Canadian economy, 50% of the oil sector, virtually all of its manufacturing, and 6 out of every $10 spent retail in this country is spent in an American store. As I say, both of us, we face similar existential challenges. The United States faces what I call the new Cold War 2.0, state capitalism, China, Russia, Japan, Korea, Arab countries, versus free enterprise. We have to combine forces because we're getting picked off separately. And I go into what I mean by that in the book. State capitalism gives its multinational companies tools and firepower our multinationals don't have. I'm in the mining industry. If you're up against a Chinese, a Russian, or another one of these countries, companies to bid on an ore body or a oil field, forget it. They will bribe, they will cheat, they will threaten. They have the government behind them. They will offer other contingent benefits to letting them get the oil field. As I say, Swiss bank accounts. China and Russia have actually been found to sell their Security Council, United Nations Security Council vetoes for certain select dictators who give them economic privileges. So this is what we're dealing with. And we're dealing with countries that have dictatorial power so they can take the long view. They're very strategic. They play chess, we play checkers. That's a problem. And the open door policy for foreign investment that Canada likes to do is hollowing us out even more than the fact that we don't have a national economy and we're all balkanized. So we've got a lot of reform to do. I was not a fan of the Canada-China trade deal because it's not reciprocal. They can come in and buy Nexen and big companies. We can't buy their Nexens, ever. They can enjoy the rule of law protection for their multinationals. They have no rule of law. So why would you open your economy in a non-reciprocal way like that? They're going to buy our oil and gas anyway. So these are some of the naive policies, and the U.S. has a similar, although they are more paranoid about Russia and China because of the throwback from the old commie versus capitalism game, than we are. But we have to be extremely cautious and careful. So we have this big piece of property, can't defend it, can't develop it. Americans are there, they're our friends, they're our partners. We basically get along. Don't have to like people a lot to get along with them. And so that's really the basis for it. And I'm not the only one that's thought that way. Canadians have voted with their feet and their wallets as snowbirds, as immigrants. And now the statistics are pretty high. If you look at Wall Street, I have an apartment in Manhattan. Roughly 400,000 Canadians work every day in Manhattan. Not just on Wall Street, insurance, the arts, media, all kinds of industries, advertising, marketing. And in Hollywood, 250,000 are there, including my stepson who wrote the score for Frozen. Silicon Valley has at least 250, if not 500,000 people living in, Canadians living in Silicon Valley. This is a brain drain that we don't get the dividends from unless we have one big economy and maybe one big entity like a European Union construct, or even more drastic. Synergies would be amazing. The politics, I have a chapter on the politics would be impossible. Absolutely impossible. There is just no way that Ottawa and Washington could get their acts together enough to pull off something this complicated and this difficult unless there was a crisis. Which is why I spent time in this book looking at what happened in Germany. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, exactly 25 years ago. It's the anniversary this year. And within 10 months, East Germany, communist, atheist, and socialist, joined and became part of West Germany because it went bust and it was a crisis and they had to do it. So you never know, if there's a crisis, things get done pretty quickly. I would hope that whoever's in power, and the reason I wrote this book was to attack two problems that I see. I have noted for the 40-odd years I've lived here, among the chattering elite classes in this country, a distinct, odiferous, anti-American attitude, which is very offensive to me. And pretty stupid for a country this dependent. In the U.S., for 40-odd years of living in Canada, I have noticed extreme ignorance about Canada and its potential or its importance, or in any way, shape, or form. So I went after ignorance in the U.S. with this book, and it's been very interesting. It's on reading lists in some universities now, and I went after the anti-Americanism in Canada among the chattering classes. And I think I pretty much pulled it off. As far as Canada going forward, the last chapter is, okay, what if there's no merger? Then what do we do? Well, ICC. We have to have a national economy or we will never get anywhere. We'll spin our wheels as 13 little provincial territorial entities and get picked off one by the Chinese, Americans, European, whoever, you name it. The First Nations problem is a bigger impediment to development than people realize. And I get into, in this book, why it's an impediment, why our Constitution can't cope with it, because the British left us with a terrible division of powers. The provinces are in charge of the use of the land, and the federal government is in charge of protecting the First Nations, and they end up in court fighting over claims, the two levels of government, and the taxpayer, there's only one, we're paying legal fees on both ends. And it's tied up development. And it's going to tie up development going forward, and it keeps the First Nations at the bottom of the heap because they don't have title to land, they don't have a say, and they really need bootstrapping. The First Nations has to be dealt with. You say, well, how can we deal with it? We can't change our Constitution. There are things you can do. Australia had exactly the same issue because the British kind of left them in the same mess, except they had a better Constitution. And they fixed it. It took 25 years. And now Australia and their Aboriginals, I'm not saying there aren't social problems among the Aboriginals, but they are fully partners, they are all bought in, they get a piece of the rock, and Australia's economy, with 2/3 of our population, is probably going to overtake us in 2 years. We can't get things done in the resource side. Can't get things done. I was on a gold mine company board in Quebec. We thought we had free title. The minute we started to produce a lot of gold, we have claims from 5 bands. 5 First Nations, all claiming that our mine was on their land. That sets in motion a 30 to 40-year legal fight between the province and also becomes an impediment for us in terms of borrowing money against the asset in the ground to expand the mine. So that's what we have. We have a gigantic lien on most of the country because we got to fix it. And we got to fix it as soon as we can. Militarily, and I'm not a warmonger, but Canada has really become a laggard in NATO, in NORAD, and we're spending 1% of our GDP on military, the biggest shoreline in the world, second biggest piece of real estate. And I'm not talking about warmongering, I'm talking about police action, about just pulling your weight, about deserving a place at the big boys' table, diplomatically and otherwise. So we can't just rely on the Americans for nothing. And so now you're starting to see a little action of some of the things I've said in my book. That's gotten a lot of traction in both countries. And I think the government just announced they're going to buy some big, expensive bombers or something. But, you know, it's really an issue. The Russians are all over the Arctic spying and all kinds of things, playing games. And then on the technological side, Canada has to join forces with the United States, not just letting our brains drain down there so they get all the benefit, but we have to somehow be part of that gigantic R&D monolith they have down there. They do more, and it's in my book in the synergy section, they do more R&D than the rest of the world combined by a factor of 2 or 3. Awesome firepower. They attract brains from all over the world into biotech, IT, nano, robots, and of course their government spends a ton. I saw a recent schematic of the iPhone. And all of the features in the iPhone that were unique to the iPhone, you know, the expanding and this and all the doodads. were all developed by U.S. Defense Department branches and given to the economy to commercialize without any cost. So you do need government support. They have it, and then they commercialize it, and the rest is the rest. So on that note, Canada's a great country. We have a lot to teach the Americans. They have a lot to teach us. I say let's just get married. We're kind of dating heavily. Try common law, whatever metaphor you want to use. But this book was written because I felt I had to write it. And I felt only I could write it because I understand both sides, warts and all. And so I hope it provokes people into thinking a little bit about what policy menus are offered to you by Canadian federal policymakers and how this may affect the relationship, and maybe put pressure occasionally on creating bonds with the U.S. instead of looking down on them and trying to ignore them. So on that note, take some questions. Thank you.